Now let's talk about the antidiuretic hormone. Now we have already studied about the structure of the antidiuretic hormone. Now let's talk about its function and its regulation. Now, as we already know that ADH comes from the posterior pituitary, but posterior pituitary doesn't synthesize it. It comes from the supraoptic nucleus, which is found in the hypothalamus. So the trigger that causes the release of the ADH is basically the osmoreceptors which are found in the hypothalamus. Now these osmoreceptors are special kind of receptors which detect the osmolarity of the blood. So they detect both the concentrated blood and the diluted blood. So if there is increase in osmolarity, blood is concentrated, meaning there is less volume, and if there is high osmolarity, decreased osmolarity, it means the blood is diluted. So that means that there could be less amount of there's more amount of less amount of diuresis that being happened. So whatever the case may be, these osmoreceptors detect both the concentrated and the diluted blood by detecting the osmolarity, and then send signal to the supraoptic nucleus, and then supraoptic nucleus start to synthesize the ADH hormone, and then that ADH hormone is released by the posterior pituitary hormone into the circulation. So the osmoreceptors detect the osmolarity, send a signal to the supraoptic nucleus, which releases the ADH hormone into the plexus, and from the plexus it comes into the systemic circulation. Now the factors which might trigger the ADH hormones release, now it can be there is increased amount of body fluid osmolarity, there is decreased blood volume, there is decreased blood pressure, or more importantly the cardiac blood pressure. So there's some kind of hypertension is going on. There is increased amount of angiotensin 2, and because we know that angiotensin 2 is the most potent vasoconstrictor found in the body, so even slight increase in the amount of angiotensin 2 can result in vast amount in increase of the blood pressure. So that can too cause the increased decrease release of the ADH hormone. Next, we have pain. Pain can also release ADH hormone. And we have stress. Now, stress here means the biochemical stress. So there's increased amount of both endorphins and cortisols circulating in the blood. So whenever there is biochemical stress in the body, ADH hormone as a result is released. So all of these triggers increase the amount of ADH. Nausea and vomiting can also sometimes result in massive loss of electrolytes. Now, because electrolytes are being lost either by vomiting, so because of this, there can be a decreased amount of electrolytes in blood, resulting in increased body fluid osmolarity. And because of this, even vomiting can trigger the release of ADH hormone. Now, all of these being the triggers for the increased amount of ADH release, we also have certain triggers which decrease the secretion of ADH. Now, these magnocellular neurons are releasing the ADH. Now, once the ADH is released, it acts on the kidney. Now, in the kidney's tissue, there are two kinds of distinct variation. One is termed as the medulla, while one is termed as the cortex. Cortex is the outer, while medulla is the inner tissue layer. And they both empty into the pelvis of the kidney, and while that pelvis empties into the ureter. So whenever ADH hormone is secreted by the magnocellular cells into the systemic circulation, it affects both the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. Now, its primary effect is usually on the collecting duct, but it can have some effect on the distal convoluted tubule, because distal convoluted tubule, if there is some effect of ADH, will reabsorb the water, while collecting duct is usually submerged into the medulla. Now, this layer here can be divided into, this is the cortical area while this is the medullary area. This is the loop of Henle, and loop of Henle only deals with the absorption or the transport of the salts. It does not have any effect on the transport of the water. It is only the proximal convoluted tubule, that is here, and the distal convoluted tubule that usually reabsorb the water. And when there is increased amount of ADH hormone, well, there is increased amount of ADH or increased amount of water being reabsorbed from the urine formation into the interstitium, from where then it is poured down into the circulation. Now it achieves this effect via two receptors and channels. Now the receptors are termed as the vasopressin receptors. Now these vasopressin receptors are usually of three kinds. There is V1A, V12, V1B and V2 receptor. In kidneys, both in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, it is the V2 receptor which is most commonly found and has the direct effect on the reabsorption of water. Now all of the V1A, V1B and V2 receptors are G coupled, and they all function via the influx of calcium. Now once ADH has worked on these vasopressin receptors, and most commonly the V2 receptors, what happens is there is increased expression of certain channels. Now these channels are termed as aquaporins. Aquaporins, as the name suggests, are channels which only allow the entry or the exit of water. Now there are usually 13 aquaporins found all over our body, but in kidney only the aquaporin 2 is found. So whenever the ADH is released, it binds to the vasopressin receptors, that is the V2 receptors, and because of this, both the distal convoluted and the collecting duct have increased amount of aquaporins expressed on their surface. And because the aquaporins amount increase, all the water that is found both in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct starts to reabsorb into the interstitium. So the urine in these tubules starts to concentrate. So this is the primary effect of ADH on the nephron. And through this mechanism, ADH causes the reabsorption of water and causes the concentration of urine. So in effect, it causes antidiuresis. So there's increased water reabsorption. And another thing is salt is still reabsorbed. Whenever aquaporins are expressed more due to ADH, salt reabsorption is not inhibited, because it is usually the work of the loop of Henle to work with the reabsorption of or the excretion of the sodium or all the electrolytes or salts into the interstitium. It does not has any effect to the water. So what happens is that medulla, the site where the loop of Henle is found, has a more concentrated interstitium. So whenever the collecting duct expresses aquaporins, the interstitium starts to lose its concentration and starts to have a more diluted interstitium present in them. But the point that needs to be taken here is, just because water is being more reabsorbed into the bloodstream via aquaporins, salt's reabsorption is not altered. Now, there is some evidence that because of dilutional hyponatremia, there might be some effect on the decreased absorption or release of the aldosterone, but it's still a bit conflictory. So, salt's reabsorption will continue along with the water. Now, ADH can also be remembered as a mnemonic. Now, A standing from aquaporins, which are inserted into the cells by the ADH hormones, which then cause the distal tubule, which leads to water reabsorption, both in the distal part, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. That leads to the highly concentrated urine. So there's high osmolarity. So ADH can also be remembered by this mnemonic. So because of the ADH, there's usually about 14 to 16 liters of water being reabsorbed into the systemic circulation on a daily basis. So even if we do not have these triggers which increase the excretion of ADH, ADH normally reabsorbs about 14 to 16 liters of water in 24 hours span. That is a lot of water being reabsorbed, and that is the reason it is known as the antidiuretic hormone. Now, like I said, that there are also some triggers which may inhibit the secretion or the release of the ADH hormone. These being, if there is decreased body osmolarity, that is again detected by the osmoreceptors. It can be due to increased blood volume. It can be due to increased blood pressure. It can be due to atrial natriuretic peptide. Now, ANP usually has a effect on heart, and because it has an inotropic effect on heart, it causes increased amount of blood pressure, resulting in hypertension. It can also be due to the excessive intake of ethanol. Now, all of these triggers will decrease the amount of ADH, resulting in a more diluted urine to be passed by the patient.